No one could calm the billionaire's baby until the maid held him. The mansion was worth more than most cities' skylines, but to Naomi Carter it felt cold. She had worked there for 3 years, polishing marble floors, folding silk sheets, dusting priceless art that didn't belong to her. To the world, the house belonged to Alexander Whitmore, a tech billionaire whose name dominated headlines. But inside those walls, silence ruled. Alexander rarely spoke, the staff rarely smiled, and the nursery was always empty. The baby had been born weeks ago, yet no one ever heard him cry, until that night. It was past midnight when Naomi heard it, a sound so faint she thought at first it was her imagination, a thin, broken cry slipping through the marble hallway like a ghost that didn't know it was dead. She stopped in her tracks, breath caught in her throat, every rule of the house rushing back into her mind at once. The nursery was forbidden ground. No staff were allowed inside, not at night, not ever. Alexander Blackwood had made that rule himself, his voice cold and absolute, the day after his wife died bleeding on those very sheets during childbirth. The baby was to be cared for on schedule only, feedings, checks, silence, no attachment, no mistakes. Naomi had nodded like everyone else, eyes down, hands folded, promising obedience. But the crying didn't stop. It grew weaker, uneven, as if the sound itself were running out of strength. Naomi's heart began to pound. She told herself to walk away. She told herself this house punished those who crossed lines. She told herself that grief had turned Alexander into a man who did not forgive. Still, her feet moved, slowly, carefully. Each step toward the nursery felt like stepping closer to a cliff. Her hands trembled as she reached the door, fingers brushing the polished handle. For a moment she hesitated, memories flooding in of whispered warnings from senior staff, of people dismissed without explanation, of doors that closed forever. Then the cry broke again, sharp and desperate, and something inside Naomi snapped. She pushed the door open. The room was dim, lit only by the soft glow of a night lamp shaped like a moon. The air smelled of powder and unused blankets. Inside, the billionaire's newborn son lay alone in his crib, tiny fists clenched, face red and wet, chest hitching with uneven breaths. There was no nurse, no monitor alarm, just the sound of a helpless child fighting the dark by himself. Naomi felt tears sting her eyes. He was so small, too small to be alone. Without thinking, without planning, without weighing consequences, she crossed the room and lifted him from the crib. The moment she did, the crying changed. It didn't stop instantly, but it softened, as if the baby recognized warmth, recognized life. His body shook against her chest, fragile and burning hot through the thin fabric of her uniform. Naomi held him close, rocking gently, whispering words she didn't even realize she knew. It was instinct, the kind that ignored wealth, power, rules, and fear. She felt his tiny fingers curl around her sleeve, gripping as if she were the only thing anchoring him to the world. Her heart broke open. She thought of the woman who had died bringing him into existence, of a mother's arms he would never know, of a father so consumed by loss he had built walls even a baby could not cross. Naomi checked the room again, half expecting someone to burst in, but the mansion remained silent, heavy with its usual emptiness. She adjusted the blanket around the child and continued rocking, packing slowly, counting her breaths to steady herself. The baby's cries faded into soft whimpers, then quiet hiccups, and finally into fragile, exhausted silence. His eyes fluttered, unfocused, searching before settling shut. Naomi stood there long after, afraid that the moment she put him down, the darkness would rush back in. She knew she was crossing a line that could cost her everything. But in that moment, holding Alexander Blackwood's son against her heart, consequences felt small compared to the simple truth she couldn't ignore. No child should cry alone in the dark, and if punishment came, she would face it knowing she had chosen humanity over fear. Slowly, carefully, she laid him back into the crib, tucking the blanket just right, brushing a finger over his tiny hand. He didn't wake. As Naomi turned toward the door, her chest tight, she didn't see the shadow standing just outside the nursery, nor the man watching through the crack in the door, his expression unreadable, his world quietly beginning to shift. The moment Naomi held the baby, something changed so subtly it almost felt imagined, like a shift in the air before a storm breaks. The crying didn't just fade, it surrendered, collapsing into quiet, uneven breaths pressed against her chest. His tiny body softened in her arms, tension draining away, as if he had been waiting for this exact moment, for this exact person. His fingers curled instinctively into the fabric of her uniform, clutching it with surprising strength, a silent plea and a promise wrapped into one fragile grip. Naomi's breath hitched, tears welled in her eyes before she could stop them, blurring the dim nursery lights into soft halos. She had held Barbies before, neighbors' children, cousins, the occasional infant from her old neighborhood, but this felt different. This felt heavier, sacred. Like the universe had placed something breakable into her hands and dared her to protect it. "I've got you," she whispered, her voice barely louder than the child's breathing. "You're not alone." The words came out naturally, as if they had been waiting inside her for years. She adjusted her hold, cradling his head more securely, feeling the warmth of him seep through her chest and into places she hadn't realized were cold. The mansion around her remained silent, but inside Naomi, memories stirred. She began to rock him gently, side to side, a slow rhythm that matched her heartbeat. Without thinking, she started to hum. It was an old lullaby, one her mother used to sing back when life was simpler, when the walls were thin and the furniture mismatched, when money was scarce but love was never rationed. Naomi hadn't hummed it in years. The melody carried the weight of late nights and tired smiles, of her mother's calloused hands smoothing her hair, of whispered reassurances that tomorrow would be better even when it was. The baby stirred at the sound, a soft sigh escaping his lips, his grip tightening for just a second before relaxing again. Naomi smiled through her tears. "That's it," she murmured, swaying gently. "Sleep, little one." She felt his breathing even out, slow and steady now, his tiny chest rising and falling against her own. The fear she'd carried into the nursery began to loosen its hold, replaced by something warmer and far more dangerous, attachment. She knew she shouldn't feel this. She knew this child belonged to a world of power and wealth she could never touch, to a father whose name alone opened doors and closed mouths. And yet, in that moment, none of that mattered. He wasn't a billionaire's heir. He wasn't a symbol of legacy or loss. He was just a baby who needed to be held. From the doorway, unseen, Alexander Whitmore stood perfectly still. He had followed the sound of the crying himself, drawn from his sleepless packing by a noise that had haunted him since the night his wife died. He had intended to give orders, to enforce the rules he had built like armor around his grief, but the sight before him stopped him cold. A housemaid, one of the many faces he barely registered in his daily existence, stood in the center of the nursery holding his son with a tenderness so instinctive it hurt to watch. The child was calm, peaceful, asleep, something Alexander had failed to achieve no matter how many trained professionals he hired, no matter how much money he poured into silence. He watched Naomi rock the baby, listened to the faint hum of a song that didn't belong to this cold, echoing mansion. His chest tightened suddenly, sharply, and for a terrifying second he thought the grief was returning, ready to crush him again. But this feeling was different. It didn't burn. It didn't suffocate. It ached in a way that felt almost alive. He hadn't realized how starved he was for this sight, for proof that his son could be comforted, that warmth still existed in the world he had turned into stone. Alexander leaned slightly against the doorframe, his reflection faint in the glass, a man who looked powerful to everyone else but felt utterly helpless in the face of a sleeping child. Memories he had buried clawed their way to the surface, his wife laughing softly as she planned the nursery, her hand resting over her swollen belly, her voice filled with hope he hadn't known how to protect. He had sworn never to feel that hope again. It was too dangerous, too fragile. And yet watching Naomi whisper to his son, watching the baby trust her without question, Alexander felt something crack inside him. Not breaking, not yet, but shifting, opening. For the first time since his wife's death, his chest tightened not with grief, not with rage or guilt, but with something dangerously close to hope. And hope, Alexander knew, was far more terrifying than sorrow. Alexander had built billion-dollar companies from nothing but vision and brutality. He had crushed competitors without raising his voice, dismantled empires with a signature, and stared down boardrooms full of powerful men who feared disappointing him more than bankruptcy itself. He had stood on global stages, cameras flashing, applause thundering, his face carved from control. He had never cried in public. He had never allowed weakness to exist where it could be seen. Grief, too, had been treated like an enemy, locked away behind rules, schedules, and silence. But when he saw his son smile in Naomi's arms, something inside him finally gave way. It wasn't dramatic at first. It was quiet, a subtle tremor in his chest, a pressure behind his eyes he hadn't felt since the hospital room where his wife's heart monitor went flat. The baby wasn't crying. He wasn't restless. He was calm, content, safe. His tiny lips curved upward in a soft, unconscious smile, the kind infants make when they feel warmth and security. Alexander's breath caught. That's the first time he's been calm, he said quietly, the words slipping out before he could stop them. Naomi turned sharply, shock flashing across her face like fear caught in headlights. She hadn't heard him enter. Her body stiffened, instinctively bracing for punishment. "I am sorry, sir," she stammered, her voice shaking. "I didn't mean to. I heard him crying and I knew the rules. She stopped, unable to finish, eyes darting toward the door as if calculating how quickly she could leave before being dismissed or worse. Alexander lifted a hand, not in anger but in surrender. "Thank you," he interrupted, and the sound of his own voice breaking startled him more than anything else had in months. The word hung in the air, fragile and exposed. "I didn't know how to hold him," Alexander admitted, each syllable costing him something. "Every time I tried, he screamed, and all I could hear was the doctor telling me I was about to lose them both. I was afraid," his jaw tightened, he swallowed hard. "I was afraid I'd lose him too." Naomi's expression softened instantly. Fear melted into understanding, into something gentler. She didn't speak. She simply nodded, as if acknowledging a truth too heavy for words. Slowly, carefully, she stepped closer and adjusted her hold on the baby. "It's okay," she said softly, "not as an employee, not as a subordinate, but as a human being. He just needs to feel you. Barbies know." Alexander hesitated, his arms stiff at his sides, uncertainty radiating from a man who had never doubted himself in his life. The idea of holding his son terrified him more than hostile takeovers or hostile governments ever had. Naomi gently placed the baby into Alexander's arms, getting his hands, showing him how to support the tiny head, how to keep him close. The moment felt impossibly intimate, unbearably fragile. Alexander froze, barely breathing. Seconds passed. The baby didn't cry, he didn't tense. He simply shifted slightly, nestling into his father's chest, his small fingers curling against Alexander's shirt. The calm remained. Alexander let out a shaky breath he hadn't realized he was holding. His shoulders sagged, years of tension collapsing inward. His eyes burned. He's not crying," he whispered, disbelief laced through his voice. Naomi smiled softly. "He knows you," she said. "He's been waiting for you." That was it. That single sentence cracked the last wall. Tears spilled down Alexander's face, silent and unstoppable. He didn't wipe them away. He didn't care who saw. His grip tightened protectively as he bowed his head over his son, his forehead resting gently against the baby's soft hair. All the rules he had built, all the distance he had enforced, all the cold efficiency he had wrapped around his grief shattered in that moment. He hadn't failed his son. He had been hiding from love because it hurt too much to risk again. Naomi stood quietly nearby, giving him space, bearing witness to the collapse of a man the world believed unbreakable. Alexander straightened slowly, eyes red but clearer than they had been in months. He looked at Naomi not as staff, not as someone beneath him, but as the person who had done what he could not. "Stay," he said, the command gentle, uncertain, almost pleading. "Please," Naomi nodded. And in the soft glow of the nursery, with a sleeping child between them, the walls around Alexander Whitmore's heart finally collapsed, not into ruin, but into something resembling a home. Days later, Alexander asked Naomi to sit with him, a request so unprecedented it sent a ripple of disbelief through the staff before the words even reached her. No maid had ever been invited to sit in Alexander Whitmore's presence. Meetings were conducted standing. Instructions were given without eye contact. Employees were meant to be invisible. Yet there she was, seated across from him in the quiet study overlooking the frozen gardens, her hands folded in her lap, her posture rigid with uncertainty. The room smelled faintly of old books and polished wood, a space built to impress and intimidate, just like the man who owned it. Alexander looked different now. Still powerful, still impeccably composed, but something in him had softened, as if the sharp edges had finally dulled. He didn't speak right away. He stared out the window for a long moment, jaw tight, eyes distant, as if he were gathering pieces of himself scattered over years of survival. "I haven't spoken to anyone about this," he said finally, his voice low and measured. "Not my board, not my lawyers, not my doctors." He turned to face her. "Not even myself." Naomi remained silent, sensing that words would only break whatever fragile balance he was holding together. "I told the world I lost my wife," Alexander continued. "And that's true, but it's not the whole truth." His fingers tightened slightly around the arm of his chair. "When she died, something else went with her, something essential." He exhaled slowly. "I lost myself." Naomi felt her chest tighten. This wasn't a confession meant for her position. This was the truth of a man who had nowhere else to put it. Wealth gave me power, Alexander said. It gave me control, options, insulation from consequences, but it didn't give me love. It didn't give me courage. He let out a humorless breath. I convinced myself that distance was protection, that rules would keep pain away. He glanced toward the hallway leading to the nursery. The room wasn't empty because of rules, he admitted. It was empty because I was afraid. The word landed heavy between them. Afraid. Naomi looked up at him then, truly seeing him, not as a billionaire, not as her employer, but as a grieving man who had mistaken isolation for strength. I was terrified, Alexander went on, his voice quieter now, terrified that if I touched him, if I loved him, something would take him too, so I stayed away. I hired professionals, I built schedules, I turned my son into a responsibility instead of a child. His eyes met hers. And then you walked into that room. He paused. You didn't see a billionaire, you didn't see a rule. His voice wavered. You saw a baby who needed someone. Naomi swallowed, emotion pressing against her ribs. Money can buy silence, sir, she said softly, choosing her words with care. But children need warmth. Alexander closed his eyes at that, the truth settling into him with a quiet finality. In that moment, something shifted, not dramatically, not loudly, but permanently. That night, long after Naomi returned to her quarters, Alexander sat alone in the nursery, his son asleep against his chest. He watched the rise and fall of the tiny body, felt the warmth he had been denying himself, and made a decision that shocked everyone the following morning. He dismissed half the professional rotation. He rewrote the rules of the house. And for the first time in his life, Alexander Whitmore chose connection over control, presence over power, and love over fear. Naomi wasn't fired. The fear she had carried for days, the quiet dread that every step she took might be her last in the mansion, dissolved with a single sentence spoken in Alexander Whitmore's steady voice. She was promoted to primary caregiver and family guardian. The title sounded unreal, almost fragile on her tongue, as if saying it aloud might make it disappear. No maid had ever been elevated beyond service. No employee had ever been invited into the private center of Alexander's life. Yet here she stood, holding a written contract that rewrote not only her role but her future. The mansion changed almost immediately. It wasn't something that happened overnight, but a gradual thaw, like winter loosening its grip. Doors that had once stayed closed were left ajar. The halls no longer echoed with emptiness. Soft voices replaced hushed footsteps. Laughter, hesitant at first, then genuine, began to live in corners that had known only silence. The nursery, once immaculate and untouched, filled with life. Toys appeared. Blankets were used instead of displayed. The baby's cries were answered before they became desperation. Alexander was there more often now, awkward at first, learning how to hold, how to soothe, how to exist in moments that couldn't be controlled or scheduled. Naomi guided him gently, never correcting, never judging, only showing. She taught him how to listen to the rhythm of his son's breathing, how to recognize the difference between hunger and fear, how sometimes the answer wasn't logic but presence. The staff watched in disbelief as the man they had known only as distant and untouchable knelt on nursery floors, paced hallways at night, and allowed himself to be seen. Alexander began eating meals in shared spaces instead of alone. Meetings ended earlier. Priorities shifted. And something remarkable happened. The house felt warmer, not because of money or luxury, but because love had finally been allowed inside. Months passed. The baby grew stronger, brighter, quick to smile, quick to reach for familiar arms. And then the headlines broke, sweeping across global news outlets with the force of something no one had predicted. Billionaire launches global foundation for single parents and care workers, inspired by a maid who held his baby. Analysts speculated. Critics questioned motives. The world searched for strategy where there was none. At the press conference, cameras flashed relentlessly as Alexander Whitmore stepped onto the stage. But he didn't stand alone. Naomi stood beside him, not behind, not hidden, not unnamed. She wore simple clothes, her posture calm, her arms steady as she held the baby against her chest. When Alexander spoke, his voice carried not authority, but conviction. "This foundation exists because I failed," he said plainly. A ripple moved through the crowd. "I believed power could replace presence. I believed wealth could protect me from pain. I was wrong." He turned slightly toward Naomi, his expression open. "She didn't just hold my son," he continued. "She reminded me what it means to be human. She saved our future." The room fell silent. Naomi looked down at the baby in her arms. He smiled, wide and unguarded, reaching up as if he understood every word. as if he had always known he was safe. In that moment, no one saw a billionaire or a maid or a scandalous promotion. They saw a family built not by blood alone, but by courage, compassion, and one simple act of love in the dark. And the baby smiled, knowing, even now, that he had been loved from the very beginning.